in cui Roma aveva Cesare, Virgilio ed Augusto.
Benito Mussolini was the father of fascism, a political movement that would trample rights and freedoms far beyond Italy's borders. But in its early days, few knew what fascism was or what it was capable of. Mussolini had seized the Italian government in 1922, aided by black-shirted thugs and backed by industrialists and bankers. Much of America's press embraced Mussolini. Seduced by his force and charisma, journalists praised him for reviving Italy's economy and saving the country from Bolshevism. They were able to overlook fascism's brutal underside for almost 2 years. In June 1924, Seldis received a bulletin from Rome in his Berlin office. Socialist deputy Giacomo Matteotti, leader of the anti-fascist opposition, was entering Parliament when a black limousine pulled up.
They literally and figuratively took him for a ride, kidnapped him right off the street into a car, took him out to the country.
The car was identified as belonging to one of Mussolini's top fascisti. 1 week later, Matteotti's body was found with 24 stab wounds. The incident brought Il Duce's government to the verge of collapse. Mussolini's response was swift and effective. He mobilized his terror squads, eliminated the anti-fascist press at home, and censored the foreign press. He came before Parliament and announced the arrest of suspects. He claimed he could save the country only with a full, personal dictatorship. No one opposed him. Mussolini had not only survived the crisis, but consolidated his power. When Seldis arrived in Rome months later, the assassination had long disappeared from the headlines. But Seldis learned that the story was still unfolding.
Some of the men were making confessions on who started it, who engineered it, and who paid for it, and what the whole thing was all about. And these confessions were available, photographs of them, you see. And some of my colleagues, I won't mention names now, had them. They said, you can buy them, we'll take you. They took me around and I bought a set of them.
Seldis's story shocked the Mussolini regime. Fascist officials were negotiating with American government and business leaders for loans to finance Italy's huge war debt. Political scandal could turn America against Mussolini and threaten the future of the fascist government. George Seldis had to be stopped. Italy's largest daily attacked Seldis, calling him a liar, a communist, and a grosso porco, a big swine. Mussolini sent his foreign minister, Dino Grandi, to the American embassy. Grandi warned Seldis is representing the Mussolini government in the worst possible light. If he does not stop, he will be expelled. Seldis responded in writing.
We are required to give facts, to relate happenings, not viewpoints of foreign governments. The American people are not satisfied with official government statements alone. My duty to my American employers is to give a fair, unprejudiced report of facts, and I must give both sides to every question. I hope I have made myself clear.
Mussolini was in a bind. He risked alienating the entire foreign press corps if he took further action against Seldis. He backed down, for the moment. And Seldis continued to file his stories.
George Seldis was an incorruptible man. He was either going to report what was really going on, report things he was very sensitive to, or he wouldn't report at all because he regarded that as a distortion of the reality. And that was typical of him. But it's not typical of all reporters, not always because they're craven, but because they make this deal with themselves. I'll tell a little bit and not all, and a little bit is better than nothing. And it's a good question whether a little bit is better than nothing.
Inside Rome's foreign press office, Seldus's colleagues began to offer advice.
They all said to me, look, you've got a good job here, it pays well, you live better than anywhere else. Why don't you just overlook these things, you know, like we do. And someday when we leave the country, we'll write the whole facts then. We won't suppress them, but don't do it now every day. And I said, if a story comes up, no matter what it is, and it's straight news and they can't deny a word of it as false, I'll send it. Well, that's how I was brought up to be a reporter, you know.
Fascist violence continued. A mob savagely attacked Giovanni Amendola, the new leader of the anti-fascist opposition. Partially blinded, Amendola later died of his wounds. The fascists approved only the official version of the attack. 2 weeks later, Seldus finally got the facts through. Within days, Dino Grandi ordered him expelled and announced that for George Seldus, sojourn in Italy is no longer advisable. Most of the American press corps in Rome rallied behind Seldus and petitioned Grandi. After a stormy meeting, Grandi agreed to reconsider. The reporters returned to Seldus's room to celebrate their apparent victory.
I think it lasted till about 3 or 4 in the morning when we were still celebrating. There was a knock on the door. Pack your stuff, you're taking the Orient Express for Paris today. The train stopped just before the French border, and everybody said, why is the train stopping here? This is not the normal stop. I heard voices, and I started looking around, and I finally made out what they were saying. They were saying, Dove, where is Seldus? Dove Seldus, they were shouting. And they went from compartment to compartment looking at everybody and saying, Dove Seldus. Well, I guessed at once at what was up. And I had seen some officers, British naval officers. So I knocked on the door, and, you know, you don't make friends with British strangers, especially on a train. I said, gentlemen, if I weren't about to be killed here on this train, I wouldn't break in on you. I'm the Chicago Tribune correspondent. I'm being expelled from Italy. Well, that perked them up, and they told me to explain the whole thing. And I said, do you hear the commotion? They're yelling, Dove Seldus. They'll be here any minute now. So one of the men with a lot of stripes said, we are 4 admirals here. The other 2 are in civies. So sit with them. The door was pulled open, you know, like this, Dove Seldus, you know, yelling. And Admiral said, we are 5 British officers from Malta, and you porco fascisti, you know, fascist pigs, porco fascisti, out. And the moment they called, an admiral called them porco fascisti. Oh, perdoni, signori, perdoni. They groveled and got out. We heard them, and then further down toward the end of the train, Dove Seldus, they kept on looking for them.
Seldus's exploits made the front page, but it was Mussolini who would benefit in the long run. In Rome, the expulsion had a chilling effect. Foreign reporters became more cautious, and 2 colleagues told Seldus that he had been sold out by a fellow correspondent. Dean of the Press Corps was Italian-born Salvatore Cortesi of the Associated Press. He not only admired but advised Mussolini. His son Arnaldo wrote for the New York Times.
The Associated Press and the New York Times, the 2 main news were Italian fascists. If an American newspaper had employed a communist in Russia, can you imagine what a scandal it would have been? I don't mean the New Masses or the Daily Worker. I mean the New York Times or the New York Tribune or something like that. And yet in Italy they did it?
Salvatore Cortese had powerful friends. He assured Mussolini that expelling Seldis would have no repercussions. He knew that Seldis's publisher, Colonel McCormick, admired Mussolini and would not protest censorship in Italy as he had in the Soviet Union just 2 years earlier. Another Cortese acquaintance was American banker J.P. Morgan, who hoped to profit by refinancing Italy's war debt.
When Seldis was expelled, there probably was not much sadness that this troublemaker is expelled, because there was some inherent sympathy with Mussolini. Don't forget that Mussolini's regime was the corporate state, was the government in partnership with the large business interests for the good of the country, so they said. And for the good of the country, that meant suppressing dissent. It meant giving a rosy picture to what was happening in this partnership. And that had considerable sympathy in American governmental and business circles.
With Seldis gone, the American press glorified Mussolini even more. Fascist spokesmen were routinely published without comment. A New York Times editorial even compared Mussolini favorably with America's founding fathers. With an enthusiastic press paving the way, the United States Senate approved a generous settlement of Italy's war debt, and J.P. Morgan made an unprecedented loan of $100 million to the Italian government. Together, they guaranteed the survival of Italian fascism well into the future.